Today's top story from the perspective of someone who's there.
You are looking live.
This just in.
Not my beat.
That's right. We're welcoming in the birthday boy, Sam Fortier. When is the actual day that we're celebrating here? I know it's this week, but when is the actual birthday?
Wow, this is quite a way to come onto the show. I appreciate you. I appreciate Ann for playing that. The actual day is Friday.
Okay, there you go. So I'm very sad that I will be out of town and unable to celebrate with you guys. But we will send you the best wishes from South Carolina, where we'll be, and we'll certainly the wife and I, who Sam does actually know my wife, we will celebrate you properly when we return. That is a promise.
I appreciate that. We'll definitely have to get it together.
Excellent. So I want to do two kind of big things topic-wise for you today. One is your birthday. No, I'm just kidding. One is talking about draft charts because you have actually studied these and they've become a big deal, not only with the Sam Howell trade, but what would it actually look like if the Vikings wanted to offer a war chest? Like, how do the picks match up? So I want to go into that, and then I want to get to the article that you wrote that just came out for the Post. Sam wrote a great article, Inside Adam Peters' team building strategy and roster building strategy. So we'll get to that in a second. But let's start with the draft charts. Like, when do these draft charts start, and how have they evolved over the years that these teams are still using versions of them to make these deals?
So I appreciate you having me on to talk about maybe the nerdiest thing that I do, and that's a competitive list.
That is a hell of a list.
But I love talking about draft charts. I love figuring them out. So, I mean, look, basically draft charts try to quantify the value of each draft pick. And the history of this starts in 1991. There's a petroleum engineer named Mike McCoy in the Dallas Cowboys facility. It's right when Jerry Jones buys the team, hires Jimmy Johnson, and they're like, hey, how do we, as new guys, start getting, basically getting an edge on these guys who have been in the league forever? So they start by basically creating the Jimmy Johnson draft pick value chart, which has a ton of problems that we can get into if you really want. But basically, McCoy looks back at all the trades that have happened over the last 5 years or something like that, and he starts to, he's a math guy, right? He's a petroleum engineer. He starts to figure out, okay, if I set the first value at 3,000, and here's a linear regression, blah, blah, blah. And so basically, over the last 33 years, a bunch of people have tried to improve upon that model. And basically what they've found is the Jimmy Johnson model, which is misnamed, misunderstood. It basically has captured the overconfidence of those executives in the 80s that they were going to pick the best player out of all the players. And basically what they've figured out, the newer charts, is that the value declines more slowly than Jimmy Johnson would tell you. Basically, you don't know as much as you think you do. You are not as able or as skilled as you think you are to pick the right player every time. And so what the new draft charts tell us is basically you're not as smart as you think you are. It's better to have more picks, but it's better to have more higher picks, and they all come up with different values. Now, I know I'm rambling here, but if the Vikings were to trade up with Washington, it's not a thing, or someone else, or New England, it wouldn't be a thing where you could look at the chart and say, okay, well, this equals 100, this equals 100, this is the trade, because when you're going up, particularly for a quarterback, teams are going to charge you premiums. It's never equal. So you're going to have to pay, probably if it was 100, it'd be 110, 120, depending on how competitive the trades for those picks are. Now that I've talked for about 2 minutes, do you want to jump back in and ask me a question?
Yeah, no, that sounds good. But you laid a fantastic foundation for me to then ask you a couple of different questions off of, including a giant strategy question. But let's flesh out the charts a little bit more. So just to give people a more clear eye on this, what was, and we just can pick one example, right, from chart to chart. What did Jimmy Johnson get wrong that these more recent charts have tried to get right? And I think the mid rounds are a good example of this.
And I would say that I don't mean to dump on Jimmy Johnson totally, because I think at the time it did what it needed to do, right? It created a currency for a thing that people just did not have, language to express. It was like, hey, if I'm trying to get a player from you, or if I'm trying to go up, it just was a cheat sheet basically for an executive to say, how do I not look silly if I'm trying to trade back and this team is offering me X and this team is offering me Y? What it got wrong basically is the confidence that those old time GMs would have about I looked at this guy, I saw him practice. His girlfriend is good looking. This guy's going to be a good player. It basically was like, hey, you shouldn't be as confident as you think you should be. And so the value of a first round, the first pick in the first round is really high, but the pick in the middle of the third round is not that much lower. It's lower for sure by quite a substantial amount, but just not as low as the Jimmy Johnson chart said it was.
So that gets to kind of this philosophical question, and we're going to talk about this more here on the show in the back half of the hour in our Never Read the Comments section. But people will then take some of that same logic and be like, well, then you shouldn't take a quarterback at 2 because the best quarterbacks wind up being like the 11th pick with Mahomes, or they have their examples of plenty of guys who have been successful later in the draft. They've gone to good situations. They were good players. Scouts missed on them for whatever reason. And my counter argument to that is not that like you're wrong, because obviously the facts are the facts, but that there's not actually a better place to be. Like that and we talked about this last time you were on. If you think that you're right at 2 at quarterback and you think one of these guys is awesome, you don't mess around with the trade. You just take them. So how do we balance those? Like, as you talk to executives around the league and scouts who are hoping to be the lead executive one day, how do they balance that reality that the charts prove out over time that more swings is better with, hey, man, if you got that number 2 pick and Drake May or Jaden Daniels or whoever is sitting on the board and you really like them, like, you should just take that player?
Yeah, so I think that this is a really complicated discussion in which there's a lot of nuance and gray area, and like the people who are paid a lot of money to make these decisions and have all of the information, like, get it wrong very regularly. Or, in the case of San Francisco, when they go up to get Trey Lance, like, just things don't work out for a variety of reasons. Sometimes the player, sometimes the system, sometimes the coaching. Like, this is just sometimes it's the market. Like, sometimes it's an incredibly complicated, nuanced discussion. And I think I have talked about this with a guy named Logan Paulson, who you might know.
I've heard of him. He's very tall.
Right. And so
yeah.
He and I have talked about, actually, like, there's probably 2 philosophies here. And like, when you're talking about Drake May or Jaden Daniels, if you're at number 2 and you think, hey, one of these guys has the potential to be a top 10, top 5 level quarterback who can go toe-to-toe with Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen in a playoff game, if you think it's possible to get one of those players to that ceiling, you have to take them, because that is the whole thing. Daniel Jeremiah on a podcast the other day said, like, teams are just in the draft looking for a quarterback that will keep them out of the quarterback market for the next 10 to 12 years, because it's the hardest thing in the league. No one has the magic sauce. You just have to figure it out. But the other thing that Logan and I talked about, if you do not feel that Drake and Jaden are in the top, it can be a top 5, 10 guy because of whatever flaws they have. And I think that's a reasonable conclusion to come to. I think they're both very talented players who will be very good. But if Adam Peters is sitting there and says, I don't know, then I think you can trade down and say, okay, we're going to get a game manager quarterback like they had in San Francisco. And I don't use that label as, demeaning. But, okay, then we need to go down and get this guy, and we need to build the team up around him like they have in San Francisco. So, but Adam Peters, I would say that if you traded down, that decision would be incredibly high stakes, because if you move down and some other team like the Vikings go up and they take Drake May or they take Jaden Daniels, and then that guy is awesome and he's going to the NFC or AFC championship game every year, then you are going to hear that from your owner, from your fan base forever. And so you probably won't have that job forever. So I would say, those are kind of the 2 tracks that I'm thinking about here in terms of Drake May, Jaden Daniels staying at 2.
Yeah, 100%. So let's combine this conversation a bit and then move on to that bigger roster building question that you wrote about. Sam Fortier from the Washington Post is with us. Like, what does a Minnesota offer, do you think, realistically look like? Are we talking 11, 23, and 2 more first rounders? Are we talking 1 more first rounder? Like, does Washington have to give up anything besides 2 to quote unquote even it out? Like, what does, if Minnesota is in a bidding war and decides, like, we're getting Drake May and they're going to have to be insane to make us say no, what does that kind of offer look like?
So the trade charts on this vary by chart, obviously, but I would say at minimum, you're going to have 2 firsts. And then, like we talked about, right? Like, this the charts, it's hard to peg what exactly the offer should be because you're not looking for equal value. You're looking for surplus value. And how much surplus value you can get depends on how many teams are talking to you. So if the Giants want to move up, it's, then it's like it would have to be even higher because they're in the division. In Minnesota, you don't want to go back to 11, but maybe you can then go back up to 5 or 7 or whatever. So I want to give you an answer. I think 3 first-round picks, 11, 23, and next year would be the starting discussion. But then you have to imagine, are you really comfortable going back to 11? Are you really comfortable? Do you think you can move back up? Would you want to move back up? Who is the player you would take at 11 or what range of players? And so I don't know what the exact offer would be, but it would have to be a lot.
I totally agree. And there's acknowledge the risk involved, but also acknowledge that as you and Logan have talked about, and Logan and I have talked about separately, is like, if you don't love one of these guys, that might be a risk you're willing to take. It just depends, because it also affects on how big of a risk you think it is. If you don't think it's that big of a risk to quote unquote downgrade from Drake May to JJ McCarthy, and you feel confident about getting McCarthy, or you feel like Jaden's going to drop, I've seen that projected some places too, then you do it. Okay. Sam wrote a great piece in the Post. I think I saw it today. Might have come out yesterday. Sorry, I don't check your byline every single day. I'm just such a horrible friend. But you wrote about Adam Peters' roster building strategy and how this year is a bit of a bridge year. What do you mean by that? And I guess more importantly, what does he mean by that if people around the building are using that term?
I say that he is building a bridge roster, particularly in free agency, because if you look at the way he's approached free agency, despite all of the cap space, the highest base value contract he's given out is 3 years, $33 million to defensive end Dorrance Armstrong. I think that, when you look at the way that other teams around the league have approached free agency with new GMs, like the Raiders, like the Panthers, those guys have made big splashes and locked in guys that, are going to be there for maybe the entire GM's tenure, or they're planting a stake of this is the new era. And you think back to 2020 when Ron Rivera signed Kendall Fuller in free agency. Okay, that's a 4-year deal. Like, this guy might not be here for all 4 years, but we've committed to him to be a big part of this, rebuild. Adam Peters has not done that. And he has talked about wanting to build through the draft. And obviously he has a lot of draft capital and he's going to be able to do that. But when I look at this free agent roster, I look back too at San Francisco in 2017 when Adam was there. He was the VP of player personnel when they were rebuilding after a 2-14 year. They had a very similar approach. A ton of guys, short-term, low-risk contracts. Let's raise the floor of this roster and figure out who our long-term pieces are in the draft, or maybe one of these free agents hits like Kyle Juszczyk and then he's still there. But if you look at the whole class, only 3 guys made it at least 3 seasons. And so to me, I'm looking at this free agent class and thinking the same thing. Outside of, Frankie Louvu and Dorrance Armstrong and Biotish, the center, a lot of these dudes, even though they've signed 20 of them, are probably here today, gone tomorrow, or gone next year,
100%. And I think there's also another similarity, and I'm going to bring that Paulson fella back into this because he was one of those guys on those contracts in 2017 that was in and out in a year. But they targeted guys who could reset the culture or reset the environment, reset the atmosphere, reset the whatever word you want to substitute in for culture, because that word has been poisoned now in Washington, D.C. But to me, that's Bobby Wagner can still play, but he's also going to be such a professional. Zach Ertz is going to be this professional, the guys that you look to. And I feel like as much as anything, Peters has really nailed that, where there's going to be an identity here that far outlasts, if they do it right and integrate the locker room properly with the young guys he's about to draft, it's far going to outlast the actual players that he signed this offseason.
100%. And like he said, because really you want to build through the draft. It's the most economical way. It's the best way to get guys in your building and develop them. And having, Bobby Wagner or Zach Ertz or Austin Eckler or whomever you're drafting, this takes the pressure off of them because, you have Zach Ertz who's going to figure out how to get open on third down for this young quarterback. And then, you're not putting pressure on the draft pick that you have or whatever, at the linebacker position, corner position, whatever. And so to me, it really all builds on everything, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense, which then leaves, I guess, 2 big questions that I'd like to leave you with, which one is then why is there seemingly still a hole at left tackle? It's the one position that they kind of didn't do this at. Like Corn Lucas, I guess, could be that answer, and maybe he is being brought in to start. But it does feel like that's the one position where they still have to come out of the draft, outside of quarterback, obviously, with that. And we'll get to quarterback in a second. But what do you make of that kind of key cornerstone position not seeming to be a priority of like, we got to use some of this cap space to get one of these dudes in here?
Let me clarify right off the top and say Cornelius Lucas is not being brought in to start. This is a position
right now he's the top guy on the depth chart because they don't have anybody else.
Sure, but this is a strong tackle class. This is a strong, like you are going to, even at the end of the first round, have starting caliber options, I think. And so, it is a glaring need. Yes, they will have to do it. Do they package their 2-2s and move up late in the first to get the guy that they want? I think that's possible. But what I'm saying here is I think that they will have options, and you're not going to go into week one of this season with Cornelius Lucas starting at left tackle, even though I feel like I've been a little harsh on Cornelius, who I think is a very good swing tackle and can step in at any moment, just not a guy you would want to be a starter for 17 games.
Yeah, but if he starts the first month while a young guy's learning, like that's fine. And that leads to the same kind of thing at quarterback. I think a lot of people have questions about Mariota. It's the one signing that I think a lot of people are like, wait, him? And they point to Brissett or Tyrod Taylor and some of the other options that were out there. Obviously, the Sam trade plays into this. But what do you make of the Mariota signing and why you think he was either targeted or why they were unable? Like, how much do we know at this point about how aggressively they pursued other options?
We do know that they talked to other people, including Sam Darnold. But, I mean, they landed on Marcus Mariota, and obviously they have Brian Johnson, the former offensive coordinator in Philly with Mariota last year. I mean, that I would imagine that Brian Johnson was a big part of that because everybody knows that Mariota left Atlanta in 2022 after they benched him for Desmond Ridder and did not play the role that you would want out of a veteran mentor quarterback. He went to Philly last year. He said all the right things in public. It's very hard to know, what he was like in the meeting room with Jalen Hurts, especially when things were going wrong. But obviously Brian Johnson felt comfortable enough with him and his behavior there to bring him in. And so I would say that is, maybe the first big bet we're seeing from Brian Johnson and Adam Peters.
Yeah, and it's so funny to me that the response is often, and I would say fans and media are both guilty of this. We try to be as responsible as we can, but, that guy's so smart when he does the thing that we think he should do, and then it's like, what an idiot, instantly the second he does something else. So it's like, look, Bobby Wagner, Adam Peters is a genius. Marcus Mariota, that guy's an idiot. And like, it just is, it is pure confirmation bias on a scale of whether someone is smart or not. And that is the world that we live in, Sam Fortier.
Yeah, I mean, I would say like the NFL, like people say it's a week-to-week league, right? But like, and I think that I used to think, that's a cliche that coaches use or players use to like dodge meaningful questions. And, and sometimes I still think that's true. But like, look at Sam Howell. Like in week 10 last year, we all thought like this guy is a franchise quarterback. But, over the larger body of work and over the, situation, once you zoom out and see, okay, like these are the things that were happening, you start to realize, okay, maybe he's not that guy, or maybe they don't believe he's that guy, or there are these big red flags, including the sacks or whatever. So, I mean, like, yes, it is always confirmation bias all the time, and the best we can do is like try to be aware of it and safeguard against it.
100%, because we're responsible journalists, damn it. Sam Fortier, WashingtonPost.com/sports. You can read the piece on Peters, and if you want all the nerdiness that you can possibly imagine on draft charts, check out his Twitter feed at Sam4TR. Again, happy early birthday. Have a great weekend celebrating, and appreciate your time here on the radio, my friend.
Thanks, guys. Always appreciate coming on with you.
Hey, this is DA, and you're listening to The Hoffman Show on the Team 980 and the Odyssey app.